Welcome to the morning edition. 9 a.m. here on the East Coast for Dan and myself. Another episode of Dynasty Theory. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Holidays. If you don't celebrate anything, hopefully you at least get a few days off of work. Right, Dan? Dan, you're waking up over there. You look tired. You look groggy.
But that's the thing. I'm in vacation mode, and
I know.
the Dynasty Theory team says we're gonna go early Friday morning, which sounded great in theory on Monday, and then boy, these 9 a.m.s come quick. But always ready to go, JB.
I know. It's a busy weekend for everybody.
It is, but you myself, Mitch. Although Mitch got imperative to the state of Utah, got called into work. We're always good to talk Dynasty Theory, and I did think this was an interesting episode. As I believe Dynasty players, including you, me, and Mitch, are at different points in their strategies, their roster management. I know I'm always late to the party when looking ahead to 2023 compared to you and Mitch. Trying to stay in 2022 mode. So I think our different perspectives and strategies are good for all different listeners that'll be tuning in.
Yeah, you're still. I mean, I was poking fun, but I love the tenacity and the going through the due diligence in your leagues. You look at a league chat and it's just Dan, hey, at player A, trade offer, player B. It's like, holy cow, this dude, give it up, Dan, give it up. But you're still fighting for those semifinal victories here in week 16, hopefully gearing up for championship week 17. But yeah, I think a lot of people, even if you are competing in one of your dynasty leagues, all of your dynasty leagues, you are starting to look ahead. And that's something that a lot of people, I mean, you can even see it in the chat, in the Dynasty Theory Patreon, free for the rest of December. Come check it out. We'll give you an instant refund. But you can see in the chat, it's a lot of start-sit questions. And, we kind of got to amp it up a little bit, ramp it up, if you will, to the dynasty discussions. And a lot of it is, like you're doing. It's very redraft mindset right now, right? And we talk about that.
It is to a degree, John, but part of that, in that chat where I sent 10 different teams trades and got rejected 10 different times. Part of that was really looking for a specific trade because it is trying to compete now, but without mortgaging next year. Right. Trying to the point of our episode here today is thinking a little bit ahead to next year as well.
Yeah. So that there's never a bad time to look ahead in your dynasty leagues and start planning and start evaluating. And that's kind of the key word of today's episode. We're talking about kickstarting the offseason, but it's all about the evaluation process. And on our little thumbnail for the episode, I have a nice little flow chart going. And Mitch was like, "Oh, fancy. Looking at it, you do have to evaluate it that way. You have your dynasty team. Am I coming off a season where I was contending? If so, go in this route. If I was contending, am I set up for the future? Go in this route. Or was it a team where I mortgaged my future draft capital and I got to go this way?" So there are a lot of different boxes to check. And it leads me into the first topic that I want to discuss, kind of evaluating your roster heading into the off season. What approach do you take? So let's say we're 2 weeks from now, and the reason that we could push this episode off to Friday morning is because it is more of an evergreen episode. It's not so much, oh, what did we see in week 15? What are we doing here in week 16? This is kind of an overarching strategy discussion that is going to be relevant in January, February, March, anything leading up to free agency, the combine, the NFL rookie draft. So evaluating your roster heading into the offseason, Dan, how do you go about it?
Yeah, I mean, we could definitely start with saying we've had, in the spirit of recent football, that Zach Wilson's dead weight. We've had enough sample sizes there to almost determine that. That's just me being a little sour grapes from the recent game we all watched.
Did you have any DFS?
No DFS. It was more of a dynasty and the Jalen Hurts rosters that he was injured and you're scrambling for quarterbacks and you can't get them because everyone's gobbling them up and no one wants to trade them. And then you're deciding between Zach Wilson and a super flex, in which I diversified my strategies. I wasn't all in Zach Wilson by any means, but there were 2 rosters. I said, you know what? I'm going to roll the dice with him. The weather is going to be good for a while. Jags defense is kind of weak, and he was just terrible. Absolutely.
In that one situation, did you go with him over DJ Shark?
I think that was one of the leagues I did roll the dice.
It was
like Shark, Trace McSorley.
Yeah.
It was slim picking. So I says, you know what? I drafted this guy. That was the wishful thinking that, there was something there and he could build off last week. And I was listening to a little bit of Greg Cosell's film study, who says, hey, he had moments where he looks like he could be something. And although Cosell says, I wish he was at this point a year ago in his development. Right. So he's still just way behind in his development. So that's one thing, is I head into the offseason identifying some dead weight. And I say start with free agents. I think this is just a fresh time for everyone not to lose sight of the free agents at a minimum, as your teams might get knocked out or are in playoffs. Each week, try to eliminate dead weight on your rosters to obtain some players with some sort of upside. All right, because I know some leagues that trading deadline is that free agent deadline is gonna hit, and it's gonna freeze for a while. So now's your chance to just continue to work on the bottom of the roster. Get into, I look at trades ranging from win now to, not trying to mortgage next year to some higher risk where we are all in for this year. So really a combination of free agency and trades to help, looking out to see what contenders are out there and help bolster them to help improve your team.
This doesn't really go into the evaluating your roster standpoint, but how frustrating is it when you're in a league, and I know we talked about this in the Discord, you're in a league and there was a trade deadline and you were like, oh my God, guys, I have Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, Matthew Stafford at quarterback. I am set. And now you're here in week 16 talking about Brock Purdy. Like that's the savior this week. Like, how frustrating is it for you, because you're so active on the trade market within your league, but also, and this is a big topic on Twitter, the trade deadline versus no trade deadline. Can you think of any benefit to having a trade deadline?
No, because, if you don't have a trade deadline, you got your friends, sending you these messages right now during our show of Zach Wilson here because you're stuck with them. It really bothers me, those rosters without a trade deadline, because then you're working the free agent wire is incredibly critical. But I think we talked about it a couple weeks ago. Our good friend of the show, JJ Zachary's, and talking on shows. And now there's no, you can't trade in your leagues. I'm like, no, you can, JJ. You can trade. We do it all the time. And trying to get Brock Purdy was even hard this week, though, John.
Yeah, I essentially, in our Dynasty Theory 2.0 listener league, I moved, and I'm not contending. I wasn't in the playoffs, unfortunately, but I had Chris Godwin and Brock Purdy, who I picked up off of waivers, moved him for Deebo Samuel and a 23-second from a contender. So I was happy with that. I love Chris Godwin, but I thought that was a good move to capitalize on the Brock Purdy situation in terms of what he can provide to a contender today with all the quarterback question marks and issues going on right now. The only thing I would say in regards to a pro trade deadline, and it's not even pro, like 100% no trade deadline. I don't want one. So don't think I'm advocating for that. We don't need that rumor to get out. That will ruin me. But one thing, it kind of puts pressure on everybody. Okay, I'm looking ahead. And really, it only puts pressure on the people that are so active and looking ahead. If you're kind of, off on your own planet, not really paying attention, not super active, it really doesn't, like, the pressure is not on you. But most people, a lot of people, some people, maybe, I feel like that's getting lower and lower. I'm thinking about leagues. I'm like, maybe it is just some people. But you look at your roster and you're like, okay, these are the matchups I have going forward. This is where I think I could be. I'm looking at my quarterback situation. Running back depth is a little weak. So now the pressure is on me to get a deal done prior to that trade deadline. And I do think it helps in terms of the teams that have depth. But even then, it's a little bit of a crapshoot because like I said, you would be sleeping like a baby every night. Dan, you wouldn't have those bags under your eyes if you had a Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, Kyler. You would feel great. And now here we are, week 16 semifinals, and you can't do anything about it. It's so frustrating. So just something you kind of have to deal with. I would push in every league for no trade deadline. But you know what? There are trade deadlines in a lot of leagues. You know the rules going in. You deal with it. You can still be sour about it.
Yeah, and we've both been on both ends of that candle this season, and the leagues without a deadline, we just create our own deadlines. Like the Discord was so fun this week. We the 4-team race, and all of a sudden 3 of the 4 teams, I was the one that didn't make a big blockbuster trade and got busted for it. We ended up agreeing on a split of the pot, but still incentivizing the top place. And just the creativity and the activity in that league was incredible for not having a trade deadline.
In one day, we saw Josh Allen move, Kyler Murray move. The names are slipping me from the other trades, but like you said, they weren't just like, oh, I'll give you a third for so. They were blockbusters.
And they were very good trades. They didn't hurt the league, John. The integrity of the league still remained alive. We've got great league mates. We've built these leagues, strategically as we can, and they were very competitive. And then for the leagues that do have trade deadlines, I think it goes back to some other Dynasty Theory episodes where I've really been emphasizing, and I know you've been there as well, with just depth on your roster. Like really such a added emphasis on depth on a roster than I used to have in the past. Because I used to be like more stars and studs, wanting to get the trade for those big guys. Give me CeeDee Lamb, that cowboy on my roster, whatever it takes. And then like all of a sudden it's, boy, if you don't have a trade deadline, especially, but even when you do have a trade deadline, it was hard to get Brock Purdy this week, and no one would take Zach Wilson off my hands. So, as active as we are, that depth is critical there to have the Brock Purdy's of the world. And there's a lot of those guys, the Marlon Macks. Depth has been huge in the last week or two.
I mean, think about what Latavius Murray's return based on his cost, just things like that. You talk about you used to be more studs and duds. I always appreciated our first few startups together because I trade back. And I was like, I know Dan's going to want to move up. But it certainly goes both ways. Anyway, evaluating your roster heading into the offseason, there's many things that go into it. I know we strayed a little bit, but going through, and I have my spreadsheet, everything's color coded, looking at my strengths, weaknesses, and it goes into a few other talking points here. Everything kind of meshes together. But I think one thing, Dan, it's evaluating the risk of your roster. And what I mean by that, and in the Dynasty Theory, in my startup tiers that are on the Dynasty Theory Patreon, I went through, and not only do I have my cross-positional tiers that are focused on right now, as if we're in week 16, but then on the other tab, I have my startup tiers, and in that, it is not taking into account production right now, because this season does not matter for that. But I've gone through and I've put an asterisk next to any player that not just they could, but I firmly believe that their value one way or another is going to move throughout the offseason. So those are the players when you're assessing the risk on your roster going through. Of course, you could talk about any running back essentially, right? Especially the free agents, but talking about a Trey Lance, talking about a Kyler Murray, who we don't know how he's going to come back and when he's going to come back in 23, talking about Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady. So at this point in time, it's difficult to maneuver away from certain players because everybody has that mindset. Well, they're a riskier asset. They're a player that doesn't make sense for me because I'm not a contender to trade for, or it's a startup. I'm going to let them slip. But overall, I want to minimize that risk. And that's something I talk about often. And it's like one of my big buzzwords. If we were playing a drinking game, you'd be a little tipsy, Dan, if you had a drink every time I said minimize risk. But, that's something, and it goes hand in hand too with the studs and duds approach. I feel that if you have more depth on your roster, it helps you minimize that risk, because if I have a Josh Allen on 90% of my teams and he goes down to an injury, knock on wood that does not happen. But if he goes down, well, things might be a little tough for me, especially if there's no trade deadline. But more depth minimizes that risk. It's something that I look to do with my rosters, whether it's an existing league or a fresh startup. But in terms of what I think you might be a little bit more willing to take on risk, and correct me if I'm wrong.
You've got so many thoughts running through my head right now because I think you
Yeah.
hit on about 500 points there. So I might be mixing and matching some of my
Mix
notes
and match.
and takeaways here, JB.
Hey, it's Christmas Eve. It's Friday morning. Let's just get wild.
We'll get wild here. So risk, full of risk. Love risk. I love risk in fantasy football. Sometimes it bites me and I'm miserable for days, but overall, we always bounce back. And the depth has been very helpful this season. We watched certain players get cut on certain teams, and there are guys that I didn't even know they're still playing in the league that teams are still cutting. And I like the way I built my roster because a lot of the guys when I do cut, they're not horrible, if that makes sense. Like I've got some more depth where on those rosters where I have taken risk and traded draft capital, so I know I have no picks next year, JB, it's still not too bad because my roster was built in a way where it's pretty young, it's contending for money, and the depth is there. So I don't necessarily need those third, fourth round draft picks. Now I can't kick the can down the road forever. So I've got to make a little, decision with my rosters at some point when I want to keep or gain draft capital or for how long I could keep that roster contending. So there's just a little bit of the risk strategy and having depth. And then as I evaluate those rosters, and JB, you mentioned your tiers and targeting those guys and the organization that you have. For the listeners that are looking to jump right now, like into, next season and evaluating talent, it's one of the good things about subscribing to our Discord is you keep all your charts up to date. You share with the listeners tiers and everything, and you're always updating everything every week. Mm-hmm. Me, who's on the kind of the back end of that, I'm always referencing the tiers, like my tiers and rankings with cobwebs that haven't been changed from like the beginning of the season. And I make little highlights, and I know, but it's more in my mind than on this organized spreadsheet that you have. So if
you
you're
still
looking
have
at
Emmett Smith in your tiers, I think.
I don't know if I deleted his name. I got to double check, but so it's a little bit different than we're at different points from there. But as I look at my rosters now, age brings risks, and you're not going to be able to move Adam Thielen in the world of fantasy football if you wait too long here in Dynasty. So I want to make sure I'm moving those Adam Thielens off my roster because we know as this calendar year is changing, all those guys get a year older. And then breaking down my positions. Do I have depth at quarterback, running back, really evaluating wide receivers to know where the talent is, and having a tight end strategy. So there's a lot to it, JB. There's a lot to it.
I think another thing that can really put you ahead of the game, and especially with your league mates, and this certainly is easier if you're in just a handful of leagues or if you're in leagues with the same people, because God knows our Discord, I keep yelling at everybody, stop joining leagues with only each other, because then you start asking trade questions. Well, everything's an open book. Get out there, get out into the wild. But what we're looking at here, I think there certainly is. I don't want to say I think there is an advantage and an edge to be had when you're not only evaluating your roster, you're evaluating your league, but you're evaluating your league mates and their tendencies. I remember a specific situation that somebody in our Patreon, this had to be 2 years ago at this point, they were in a dispersal with one other manager, and I know that other manager fairly well. And they came to me and they said, "Hey, how do you think I should go through this dispersal?" And I said, "Well, there's a couple high-end wide receivers here that I know that other manager, and not even high end, like I forget who it was, but I said they're going to want to take them with these next two picks." And our patron took the two players I said, and they got a message immediately I was going to take those players. So I think that being able to go through your leagues and figure out, okay, I have guys in here, and certainly right now is critical. I have guys in here that I know are going to try to win that championship. They're not as worried if they do win the championship about mortgaging the future a little bit. So I know I can get them to overpay a little bit. I can get them to pay that contender tax. Some people, they have their values and they're not going above that, even if it means it's going to give them an edge in the championship. But also, is there a manager in my league that once they're out of contention, once the season ends, hey, I'm looking to dump all my older assets, and they look to get younger, but there's a discount to be had. I'm super active in that approach and looking to take advantage if I think there's something that fits that I'm looking at. If we're in rookie drafts, do I know that Dan is the 101 and it's a 14 team league, okay? And Bijan, but Dan needs a quarterback. Dan has the 101. And I know that he's somebody that even in April wants to have that lineup kind of take shape. Well, maybe I was going to look to move up from 102 to 101, but I think there's a decent chance that, well, his top quarterback, Bryce Young, Stroud, whoever it might be, maybe you're going Will Levis, maybe you're getting crazy, Anthony Richardson, but knowing league mate tendencies, and it doesn't always work out, but you can go through and, we talk about it in our Discord and the Patreon, and we look at somebody will share a roster or something. And I'm like we have an idea of whose roster that is, or we go through and their startups. We're like, okay, this is a Kev roster. We got those veterans on there, or this is a Roy roster. It's all draft picks. There's not one guy over the age of 24 on that team. So I do believe that there's advantages there, and it takes some time. It takes effort to get everything in order. So maybe you take notes on people. I know people do that, but just trying to remember certain things and going back, looking at trade history. What are things that certain people did? There's a lot of things that you can do there. So when getting into the off season, you can look at that.
I like Ronald's comment in the chat. Try guessing my tendencies. Good luck. I don't even know them. Ronald, we know you're a Lions fan, so every once in a while I could draft Lions. I know I can move them at some point or another to you or Mitch there, knowing owners' tendencies. But you're right, JB. I think for newer listeners, if you're just getting into a dynasty league, try to find out what you can about your league mates before you get in. Sometimes they have a Twitter page. You can find some information on Twitter, team they like, moves they're making, see how active they are in dynasty. Because as we mentioned, here we are in December approaching Christmas, and some of our crazies in our league are already in a startup somehow. So although I'm not at that point of near that point of getting a startup now, I do like following how your draft's going or just seeing the comments in the chat. And I don't think there's ever been an early startup that I haven't read, why did I make that trade? Or why did I trade, whatever it may be. And it's so if you're going into a league with John Bauer, before you trade him all your draft capital, kind of gauge who's, if you're new to this game, what you're doing before you do it, because you can't get it back. There always seems to be some regrets of some sort after the draft. And then as you get to know your league mates, build those relations. I think we all have certain teams that we just like to trade with for whatever reason. It's just cohesive, and we always kind of find something small or big, and then identify the rebuilders from the contenders, as John mentioned there. Who's the ones teams that like being young, who likes rebuilding either all the time or at that one point of the season where they just have that emotional breakdown. It's like you need an ice cream because you're out of a relationship. You need to just blow up your team all of a sudden. There's that league mate that always has that sort of moment. So having that time, and I think is really the key. And from this practice, you'll know who's moving and wanting picks, youth. And sometimes you just have to know when the time is right, because you get those other teams that only trade once in a while or so often, or it takes 100 offers to get that one, and you just don't want to lose that relationship.
Do you ever feel that you mentioned a manager that might not always be around, but they pop their head in, or they don't get many trades done in general? Do you feel like you're a little bit more aggressive with them? And what I mean by that, you're a little bit more willing to overpay for an asset just because this might be my only opportunity, because Dan's going back into hibernation here in a minute.
There's two ends of that coin there. There's one that, there's the John Bauer that Dan Lamagna always has a difficult time trading with. And then for some reason, I have this impulse trade week. So I finally made a trade with John. I'm like, did I just give up Dak Prescott for Winston and Carter? I did. So I have that guy. And then there are the other teams that maybe they're around even, but just not really active. So I try not to forget about them or lose sight of them. And they kind of become that person that comes to me with a trade once in a while when I don't see him trade anyone else, because they know I'm thinking of them and making those deals. But I do try not to be overzealous because so person finally wants to trade with me, because more often than not, JB, that person that only trades so often, when they do trade, they have these values that are just like so lopsided.
Mhm.
It's like you finally want to trade and you want me to give you like 3 stars to your 1. Like, this doesn't even make sense to me. So like we're way off, and I don't want to insult you because you're finally talking trade with me. So I try to just maybe educate a little bit on values and hope they come somewhere. And if not, I'd say pack it up. We'll get them next time.
Yeah, it's not just the inactive manager that they check in every once in a while, but also the manager like you and I we we don't throw softballs to each other. You and I, we're heavy hitters. We get jabs at each other in the league chat. I love it. And then sometimes you'll come in with an offer, or I come in with an offer. And it's like, man, this one, it's kind of close.
And it's exciting when we get close. It's like, wait a second, I'm actually going to make a trade here potentially with our co-host. And I think that's kind of one of the things I really have enjoyed over the years trading with you and Mitch is, I'm always extra mindful because, we go in a league and people are probably thinking, hey, these 3 co-hosts are probably like best buddies and working
100%.
deals together, whatever the case may be. And we are the most competitive, like JB's out to like slit my throat here making trades with me. Trust me. So when we make a trade, it's like monumental. It's you got to mark it on a calendar or something, but a lot of fun always.
There was a league, actually, I forget the exact specifics. This had to be a year ago, 2 years ago. Mitch was blowing up his team and he sent me an offer, and thinking that in the back of my mind, I was like, people know that we do the pod together. I don't need anybody thinking there's something sketchy going. It was a fine trade, but we made a trade the week for something. I forget what the exact scenario was, but with an abundance of caution, I said to him, hey, you just posted that these players are available in the chat. I'm good with this deal. I'll accept, but I want give it a day for like other people to see the message or something. And then if there's no activity, then I'm in. But it was just one of those situations that everything was on the up and up. But you can never be too careful sometimes. We have some interesting personalities in our dynasty leagues that could cause a fuss about things.
I mean, for how many years we've been doing this, it's been pretty good. It's always been competitive. We've all had different strategies. We've all landed different places. I remember the best was our original Dynasty Theory League for a while there. Like the 3 of us were at the bottom of the standings. Like there was no helping anybody there, if I'm not mistaken. And then I don't know, we had different strategies, but
yeah,
no help for each other.
No, absolutely not. Another question here. Do you find it difficult or challenging, or is it an advantage for you in general with the quick shift in season mode values to immediately going into the off season? Like there's some people, they can boom as soon as that season ends, or they weren't contending, so they were already there to an extent. Like believe it or not, and people might not want to admit it, there is a difference in that market value when points are being scored to when there's no production. And I think that could be, especially for newer dynasty managers, trying to find that balance and transitioning. Once that season ends, things change greatly. And I think that's just an important note, even if it's not an in-depth conversation here. I just think that's something to keep in mind.
I think it's a real important one. And I think it's one area, John, where I think my game's evolved the most. I mentioned that Dynasty Theory original league where like just bottomed out year 1. And it was so excited. It was like our first Dynasty Theory league for our listeners. And my team was terrible. And then this year it was one of the top teams, just building it. And I think part of having a real successful dynasty this season was really understanding values more, whether it be startup drafts, in season. And it really stood out to me late in the season with some of the trade offers coming in, JB, that people weren't adjusting values. I'm like, I know you're offering me like Kamara, Cordell Patterson, and like somebody like whoever it may be. I'm like, these guys are aging, and I am starting to think about next year because JB and Mitch are forcing me to. And I don't want those guys literally 2 weeks from now. Like, yes, they may help me this weekend, but 2 weeks from now, they're going to be dead weight on my roster. So it is important to know veterans age another year. And once this season's over, like, some of those guys are really hard to move. They're hard to move this year. They're not going to get easier to move next year. So when it comes to the values, I've done that. The later this year has went on, and I'm starting now to think about coaching changes, quarterback changes, draft day coming up, free agency, teams' salary caps, my dysfunction rankings. I can't wait to dive back into them because my values are going to start looking at the direction of the organizations, and my rankings and values will continue to evolve this offseason.
The Jaguars, they got to be rising in those rankings.
They are, man. You look at that, going from that Urban Meyer dysfunction, which I hammered last year. I hated Jacksonville, to what Coach Peterson has stabilized there. And it's only year one for him. But boy, do you see the difference in coaching can make. Just last night, watching Trevor Lawrence and the timing of his release being so much quicker from a year ago. Like, the guy actually got coaching this year, and he's starting to get hot now, and he's making guys like Zay Jones look good. So there's something there that's definitely on the rise.
Think about how much and I say we, just Twitter bashing the Jaguars in the offseason. Why would you pay for Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, Evan Ingram, and not just pay, but pay a pretty penny? And all three of them are having a heck of a season.
Think about the opportunity in Dynasty, JB. A year ago, like, Trevor Lawrence is this prodigy child here. High school, college, he was meant to be 101 in drafts. He was meant to be this great fantasy football player. And there was some great opportunities to acquire him last year. If you just, again, knew that, hey, Jacksonville had to get out of that dysfunction eventually. Like, they weren't going to stay with Urban Meyer. In 1 year of coaching, he's becoming that hot commodity again. And now you're not getting him. It's if you want to get Trevor Lawrence now, it's got to be in a deal with like Joe Burrow. It's night and day.
And then T-Law is nuts. That's from Ronnie. Cord says if Calvin Ridley can come back next year, don't forget about him. And they have right now their first is like in the middle of the pack. What if they add a Quentin Johnson? Somebody like that a big body receiver that opens things up even more for this offense. And you got ETN. Evan Ingram's probably going to be the hottest free agent tight end.
Look at the values rising. You want to talk about adjusting your values? I think you have to adjust Evan Ingram's value, especially if he, gets a contract, whatever the case may be. I think you're going to see, we've started a little bit, but Calvin Ridley is mentioned. His value is going to change. I mean, you love those guys tied to elite quarterbacks, and I think Lawrence is going to be entering that tier.
Yeah. But yeah, anyway, that whole conversation there, not to specifically talk about the Jags, but talking about Dan's dysfunction rankings. And I know the patrons, they have a lot of fun with that. We've had multiple people, hey, when are these coming out, Dan? Let's go. Get us the updated rankings. But yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation because if you have those two players tiered together, how much does dysfunction come into play in terms of an organization's stability? And do you go a different route because of that? And yeah, so we'll keep our eyes open, Dan. Hopefully, Christmas is canceled in the Lamagna house. We need updated dysfunction rankings. All right.
A lot of that comes with the offseason, though. It comes with the offseason. What draft picks do they have? Coaching changes. The coaching carousel is going to happen. A lot happens in the offseason. That's when the magic's especially made, JB.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you get the draft picks. You get what do they do in free agency? The coaching changes, if there may be any. So yeah, I'm just giving you a hard time, but we're certainly going to keep our eyes open for that. All right. The last thing I really want to talk about, you have new dynasty managers every year. You have people making that jump from redraft to dynasty, or maybe they bet or they take part in DFS. So maybe this is their first off season post startup. So they did a startup last off season, and this is their first full blown dynasty off season starting in January. Words of wisdom, Dan.
Proceed with caution. Beware of the sharks, like John Bauer. No, just kidding. But no, I think everything we talked about in this episode, you've got to mold it together and build your plan. If you could do a mock draft with some dynasty owners, if that opportunity presents itself to get some, like a first run, a test run, make your mistakes, do it. At the very least, you've got to start to understand values. You've got to understand that veterans age and they're hard to move, and you don't want to overpay for them. You don't want to draft them too early. They're going to slide in the drafts. You need to be able to learn those things, because you go to the local Walmart and you pick up a fantasy magazine. It's not a dynasty magazine. Dynasty's growing. There might be a section. There might be something if you're fortunate to get a little bit of strategy, but most of it's like redraft centered. So you really got to know those values, and you do want to start thinking about coaching and quarterback changes, because that's going to change the values this offseason. You've got to start knowing rookies and draft day, and rookies are the gold. So, how do you value those rookies? And especially when it comes to trading live during a draft, some people don't expect or don't like trading during a draft. And if you are in the Dynasty Theory League, boy, you better buckle up, because there's normally a ton of trades in the draft. So there's a lot to sponge. And I think at a minimum, and it wasn't like pre-programmed or planned, but and not even biased, I would be joining the Dynasty Theory Discord, even if it's just a free section there for the conversation in the chats. Like, it is very actionable advice that you can at least go into a draft with a game plan, so you don't have those regrets of your roster, which really stink. There's nothing worse than just bombing and having to rebuild before your draft's even done.
It's easy to have those blinders on too, and we all have certain players. Oh, I can't believe so-and-so slipped here. I can't believe, talking about trades. Oh, I would absolutely trade this player for this player. And I think that's one of the advantages of having multiple dynasty teams, because we got some folks joining late here. We're wrapping up, Stefan. We're wrapping up, but I'm glad that you can make it to the party here on this fine Friday morning. But I think that's one of the advantages of having so many teams, because you have every player essentially rostered somewhere. So it's far easier not to get sucked into that player bias. And that's where the tiers come into play, because then you're gaining that edge one way or the other. Well, I'll trade him for this guy if you give me a small piece. I'll acquire him for this guy, but I want a small piece back. Things like that, really picking up those small margins. But you mentioned the veterans, and I think this is a big thing. So you're entering your first off season. It is so easy to think, man, my team, it's not really, I finished middle of the pack. I really should get younger. Even if you're looking to enter a rebuild, even if you're not necessarily contending, be very careful and cautious about unloading assets simply because they are an aging veteran. Beginning of January certainly is the worst time to look to do that, especially if you have a guy that, for the most part, barring something crazy, their value is going to remain relatively stable throughout the offseason, like a Devontae Adams, let's say. There's probably very little that could happen where his value is going to drop significantly as the offseason progresses. So if you're unloading him in January for the future draft, for the future draft picks or young assets, think about the scenarios where if you would have traded a veteran for a late first and early second this last year, and it ended up being Sky Moore and I don't know, name another player that kind of struggled, maybe a James Cook. You wouldn't be thrilled about the outcome there, even though, hey, I'm getting rid of this veteran. The value seems okay. I actually, on the other side of it, I've said this before, to start the offseason, if there's a team that maybe they didn't unload a veteran at the trade deadline or in the playoffs, and maybe they just weren't around, but now they're here for the offseason, approach that manager and say, hey, what do you want for player A? Let's send an offer. I always hate, what do you want for that player? So let's ignore that comment. But going in, sending an offer, seeing what you can do. And even if it's a veteran, there's those guys that their value and situation is the big one, can we find something that has a relatively stable situation? And I mentioned Devontae Adams, but going through my tiers here, and I talked about getting the asterisk on these guys. Like running backs are difficult to go out and acquire, but like Austin Eckler, he's still going to be fine. Nick Chubb's still going to be fine overall, relatively speaking. See what the price is on them, because if I'm not contending, maybe give me a couple of draft picks for Austin Eckler, and it's a price that I certainly would have been willing to pay come next August or September when we're rolling into the season, but I definitely want to pay it today.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned Devontae Adams, because I love Devontae Adams. I think he's possibly the best football wide receiver in the National Football League, definitely top 3. But when it comes to dynasty draft, you would hope the dynasty owners were like hearing the hype or read something or did some stuff studying and knew it was like, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase. But then it's, easy to just revert to take Devontae Adams as maybe your wide receiver 3. But in dynasty, when you have a CD Lamb, that's so much younger, or an AJ Brown, I think it's easier to get an equally talented or pretty close that's going to be more talented for 3, 4, 5, 6 more years than a Devontae Adams would. Because in a few years, we know that time is going to come. And I'm not saying don't draft Devontae Adams, but you find those tier players. And that's where, if you can get some true dynasty tier rankings to go in a draft, you avoid that little pitfall of taking that veteran just a little too soon. And they're good to have on your roster. We're not saying don't draft any, because they can help you win leagues. But if you could get a guy equal or close in value that's 5 years younger, man, make sure you're doing that in dynasty.
Well, listen, the price certainly is going to come into play, but I don't think the price to acquire Devontae Adams is anything remotely close to a CD Lamb, like you mentioned. But I do think it is going after those players. It sounds crazy, but even like Keenan Allen, even if they go out, and it's more common for wide receivers because we have multiple receivers in the field, but even if they go out and draft a higher end wide receiver for the Chargers, like Keenan Allen, still, based on what I think his cost to acquire is going to be in the offseason, somebody that it's minimal risk based on the price to acquire today versus the range of outcomes that we're going to see throughout the offseason. Yeah, you look at a few other players like David Montgomery. Where is he going to be? There are question marks there. Dalton Schultz, Elijah Moore, Juju Smith-Schuster. So I love Juju, but he's one player specifically. His current in-season value is certainly going to be higher than his immediate value in the offseason. So if I can move him at his current value, sure, I'm in. But if I'm looking to acquire, it's going to be something where I'm looking to get him for that lower value, because now there's risk baked in, right? Mike Evans, I have with an asterisk because of the quarterback situation. What happens with Tom Brady? So yeah, don't get caught up on the names, but I do think it's an interesting opportunity and a good situation and time to go out and look to acquire those veterans, because we see it every year. Barring a crazy change in the situation, and be selective, be smart about the veterans that you're targeting. But as the offseason progresses, we're going to see their value tick up. You look at trades, you look at their trade values over time. Veterans in January, it's here. And then let me see, which way is my camera going here? So it's here. And as the offseason progresses, it swings up a little bit. And then we're in season, we score more points. So I would be very cautious if you're entering your first offseason just unloading veterans because, hey, I got to get younger. I got to get draft capital. That is a recipe for, I'm going to enter a 3 to 5 year rebuild.
Yeah. It goes back to value. What is the value of those veterans? How much gas is left in the tank? How much production can they get you? Again, my emphasis was on just not falling into that trap of getting them too early. There's not a better feeling than in a startup draft and getting a veteran at great value. They slid a few rounds too many because of that age discrimination, model that, JB always discriminates against me. There's a lot of value in age and wisdom, JB, that could help a dynasty roster as well. So there's no one to get them.
understand. I think HR is watching this show, so don't get me in trouble for age discrimination over here, okay? Cord in the chat says another good one. Don't get attached to your draft picks. Yeah, we certainly, and I say we, everybody, you have that hope and that thought. Well, this draft pick, it's bulletproof. It's not going to bust. I have the 105. That value is going to be woo. I had a trade specifically last offseason. I moved, I want to say it was 105 or 106 for Tyreek and a piece, or I moved 109 for Juju and there was a tight end involved. So 2 trades I was really happy with, but on paper in the offseason, nobody wants to make those moves because they want their picks, so I do think that's it does, like, we're not saying move your picks or acquire picks, blanket statement. It all comes down to those price points, and that's critical. And Dan, you hit the nail on the head. You said the word is value. What is it costing me to give it up? What is it costing me to acquire? So. Oh man,
that's a lot, JB.
I know. Well, I'm trying to watch my word count, and I still exceeded it, I think.
You get extra words though today because Mitchell is not here, so it's balancing.
I know. It's like you talk about targets are earned and vacated targets. You hear that argument all the time. It's vacated words here on Dynasty Theory, and I took all of them.
Always using the analytics to your advantage. I like that.
I took all of them. No, what I'm doing, I'm over here on DLF, their rookie Dynasty ADP. DLF, we're still a proud partner. We're still part of the DLF Family of Podcasts. A lot of great stuff going on over there. Go check it out. But I'm looking at it.
And while you're looking that up, I think that's you're probably taking us in a good direction here, because that's another value, JB, that I need to catch up on. We talk about different places in the offseason. Is what are those rookie values? If you do have picks and they're going to be 108, 109, or wherever it is, who can you get? Like, eventually, Dynasty listeners, before they go even swapping picks, should probably know what they have.
Now, this is in just because there's more data. This is just one quarterback, and we for the most part deal exclusively in Superflex or 2 quarterbacks. So let's bump it down a little bit. But let's say, and maybe if you're in the chat here, throw a name out going into the 2021 rookie draft. So Harris, Chase, Pitts, Etienne, Javonte Williams, that class. A player that maybe you had on your roster that you would have been happy moving for. Let's say you move a veteran and you get the 201, 202, 204. So whatever player you have in that range, and you're like, okay, that's a lot of nice draft capital. This is a good class. And you walk away with Terrace Marshall, Elijah Moore, and Rondell Moore. And you're like, I love this youth. I love the opportunity at hand. It's a tremendous gain in value. You're whistling a different tune today. And of course, I pulled somebody in that range that was on these.
That's a fun draft to look at.
Yeah, I mean,
because that goes back to evaluation too. That's where you got to mix Coach Dan's film study, I think, with John's analytics, and maybe you score a Amon-Ra St. Brown later, and you struck gold there, as opposed to Kadarius Toney. I don't know.
Do you remember how much hate and grief, not hate, well, maybe hate, you and Mitch gave me during our mock? And for our next week's episode, I'm going to clip it and put it on the episode. But I took Amon-Ra in our mock pre-draft, and JB, he's never going to amount to anything. What are you thinking? Look at what his brother did. He's a bust. Genetically, the whole family's a bust except for the dad, Mr. World or whatever. And isn't their mom like a big, or was a big time athlete?
See, that was probably my mistake. I didn't look deep enough into the family, hierarchy there and see the athletic genes that existed. I just didn't have enough information at the time, JB, to see what his ceiling actually was.
I thought his mom.
We're going deep in Dynasty Theory here.
I know.
As JB's looking up the mom's genetics for Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Well, Amon-Ra St. Brown and Equanimous, they are half German.
That was a
And
fun draft.
Amon Ross speaks fluent German. Interesting. Okay. All right, we're learning a lot here. Ron says he believes she was an Olympian. Yeah, so Dan, you didn't take into account the family genetics there, man.
He was still on my radar though. I listened to you a little bit. I'm going back and in my tiers, I go back to 2021 actually, my rookie tiers, and I did have him bolded at least, which means he was on the radar of guys to pick. Unfortunately, Jalen Darden was as well, but that's another story. That was a.
Whoa, that was the wrong one. Sorry. Hold on.
Final thoughts.
There we go. Final thoughts. And I actually have one here, and I wanted to start off the episode with it, and kind of annoyed that I didn't. Actually, Dan, give me your final thought first, because I forgot to plug in my laptop and it's about to die. So hit us.
I'm afraid to now. I might say Jalen Darden. You might manscape me again. I'm not sure. But final thoughts here is, hey, good luck to everybody in your playoff games this weekend. Still an exciting time, even though JB is looking ahead to next Dynasty season. But work your free agent wire, especially in leagues where the free agent period is going to close. That is your last opportunity to build those bottom of the rosters. Trade while you still can. There's going to be a couple more teams eliminated. So there are some specific rosters I'd be looking at this week. Let's look at those teams in the playoff hunts where you could still trade. And once those teams drop off, there's a good chance they're going to be looking to trade in a different way. So, and then there'll be 2 teams left looking to contend that might be all in now to get that top prize money. So you have 4 teams where their values may change and give you an opportunity to strike a good deal. And that is my final thoughts, other than Merry Christmas to everybody.
Well, I'm glad that I was able to plug my laptop in. So I have a final thought. Again, I wanted to start the episode off with it, but we kind of jumped right into discussions. This time of year, it can be challenging for people, with personal lives and a lot going on. And I know, a lot of people, anxiety and depression, it spikes, and it's weird to think about, because it's the holidays, it's a happy time, but it crops up for a lot of people. So I just want to say, keep in mind when you're interacting with anybody, whether it is in your league chats on Twitter, in the Discord, in the Patreon, you don't know what people are going through. So I think this is an important time of year to keep that in mind. It's always critical to keep that in mind, but especially this time of year, you don't know what people are going through, and maybe just, a nice comment here or there could really boost one's spirit. So that's my spiel.
That was your best final thought ever, JB. I actually I appreciate that, man.
I know normally I'm a goofball, but sometimes I do hit people with something serious. And it catches people off guard. I'm going to be honest. It does. But so we appreciate everybody that we interact with on if it's not a daily basis, even a weekly basis, a monthly basis, everybody in our leagues, everybody in our families, in our, work, in our daily lives. So just keep that in mind. Okay. Well, for Dan Lamagna, Mitch Sorensen, who is critical to the state of Utah, how would they still be a state without him? We don't know. I'm John Bauer. Continued, and I hope I don't butcher this, but I believe still Hanukkah, I believe. So continued happy Hanukkah for those that celebrate. And I hope everybody has a very Merry Christmas and happy holidays. So we'll see you guys next week. Spend time with your family. Peace.